in the end, what the demons are getting people to do subtly is sacrifice the moral and spiritual upbringing of their children, which women contribute, for the sake of worldly goods. That's ultimately what's happening in most of these cases.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Father Ripperger had some words to say about Satan's attack on the family and marriage in particular. And it's not something you might expect. In fact, what he said might be a little bit controversial, but we wouldn't expect anything less from such a prolific exorcist such as him. If you're unaware who Father Ripperger is, he is a world-renowned exorcist from the United States, traditional Catholic priest, expert in spiritual warfare, and he's beloved by traditional Catholics all over the world for his wisdom on the traditional Catholic ways to fight the devil. In this recent bit of a conference that he gave, it was posted by Virgin Most Powerful Radio, and he went over some of the most effective tactics in how Satan attacks your marriage. So let's take a look at this together, and we'll have a little bit of commentary.
Right now, I want to just talk a little bit about the fact that demons are, as I mentioned, attacking every aspect of marriage. But there's two aspects that they always attack. And the first is vocation, which we'll unpack that here in just a little bit. They unpack vocation, but then they also attack the roles in relationship to the vocation. So technically speaking, vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, which means to call. And it's when that occurs when a young man is about to be ordained to the priesthood, his name is actually called. And that's where it actually, right before he's ordained. So his name is called, and then he stands up and says, ad sum, which means I'm present. And then he says, and then there's a discussion about him becoming a priest. But that's the technical use of the word vocation. In the broader sense, we tend to use it, which can be a legitimate sense, but it just has to be understood it's in a broader sense. The broader sense of vocation is a calling that God gives to people to a particular state in life. And so what we're seeing is that the demons are attacking people's state in life. So when you look at vocation, the reason they attack vocation...
Thanks for watching the video thus far. I know what you're thinking. Where can I get the world's best frankincense oil? Well, I knew you were thinking that, so we got it for you. You can see that here. This is our sacred frankincense oil. We actually brought this in. Can I get this to focus there? There we go. I brought this in from the Middle East. This is from Oman, and it's actually from a region which is rumored to be the same place where the wise men would have got the oils they brought to Christ, so that's pretty interesting. And here is our lanolin balm. This is from Australia. We got this straight in. This is pure. So if you have a job where you work with your hands and they get cracked, or you have cold temperatures, you want to make sure that doesn't happen, you can buy that from us. And the best thing is, instead of supporting one of those weird companies that are run by Satanists, cosmetic weirdos, or some multi-level marketing scheme that's owned by Mormons, you can actually buy from a Catholic. Thanks for watching, and let's get back to the show. Okay, so before he continues here, what does that make you think when attacking your state in life? And what does that make you think about vocations? Because I know someone who was sort of initially formed in the very conservative Catholic world. We'd hear about all these vocations, you have a vocation to be a teacher. You have a vocation to be a nurse. You have a vocation to be, in youth ministry or something like that. And really what he's saying is, technically speaking, that's not what a vocation is. A vocation is to the religious life. Specifically to the priesthood, which makes sense. That's one of the biggest modern errors in the church today is people think that you sort of find a vocation in your soul, like there's like a corner of your soul where there's the priesthood there. But really, it's actually just something that happens when you answer the call to become a priest. Obviously, you have to discern and you have to go through, okay, I think that I should be a priest. I think this would be in conformity with God's will. But if we take this logic of a vocation as something that's sort of, imprinted on your soul, then this would mean that, there are priests that weren't called to be priests, because who knows if they actually did it by their own volition or by God's will. And then there were people who were in the married life who shouldn't be married, and that would be kind of strange if it was sort of something almost predetermined. So I like that distinction that he made.
Vocation is because if they can block the person in their vocation, in the fulfillment of their vocation, they can thwart the grace that would flow to the person and to other people through that vocation. And that's what they ultimately want to be able to do. So if you look at marriage, so we first want to talk about marriage, and then we want to talk a little bit about the roles of men and women. The actual definition of marriage, traditionally, is that it's a solemn contract. I'm going to talk about that word here in a minute. It's a solemn contract in which a man and a woman confer bodily rights for the sake of having children. Now, we want to parse that out. So it's a solemn contract. There's been a lot of talk today, and it's even in the Code of Canon Law, referring to marriage as a covenant. And that's perfectly legitimate usage if it's understood not in the more modern sense that's being proposed, which is, well, there's contract on one side and covenant on the other, and neither the twain shall meet. That's actually false. Historically, the actual definition of covenant was a solemn contract.
This is fascinating as well. What is this distinction that he makes between contract and covenant? Covenant sounds nicer. And when we think of contract, we live in such a legalistic world that, we think contracts have to do with negotiating with your insurance agent or whatever and trying to get the best deal for yourself and not get taken to the cleaners. Like, that's the idea of a contract. Or we think, you think of this idea of contract as binding somebody into something so that they can't escape without giving you what you're due. That's kind of what we think. But he's correct about this idea that marriage is a contract, because ultimately what it goes back to is this idea that it's a matter of justice. He'll explain this better than I will, but you give yourself to the spouse and the spouse gives himself to you. And there are certain responsibilities and rights and duties that both of you have. This is the nature of contract. And he's right when he mentions as well that, yes, in the new Code of Canon Law, it talks about marriage as a covenant. But this obscuring of these words and this understanding about covenant versus contract. Personally, I think this is one of the biggest, this is one of the reasons why there's huge confusion about marriage being valid or invalid. So for annulments in this massive annulment crisis, which is huge. It's been estimated by certain canon law experts that upwards of 95% of annulments might actually not be real, which is a terrible reality to think about. And, but that makes sense. I mean, if you understand what a contract is, it's very simple. It's like, did you willingly go into the contract and have a knowledge of what it was? I mean, not even intimate knowledge, but did you willingly enter into that contract and sign something? That's it. That's all that's necessary, really. Unless you're coerced, you're not in it. That would actually solve a lot of the confusion with marriages, if I could say so.
It's basically a pact that people enter into. And so it's a contract in the sense that there's legal aspects to it. This is going to become really, really important when we get to the discussion of authority. It's precisely because it's a contract that gives the wife and the husband the rights to command demons. And so this is something that we have to always remember. So as I mentioned, a covenant is just another name for a contract. It's a legal thing, which means it's part of the natural law, which binds the two parties gravely. The tradition is absolutely clear that one must render the marital debt under the pain of mortal sin. One of the principal ways that demons attack marriage is by attacking the normalcy of the conjugal life between the spouses. And the way they do that is in a variety of different ways. But one of the ways they do that is by getting each other, they drive certain things in relationship to each other emotionally so that one will deny the other party the marital debt, which is mortally sinful. The entire tradition of the church said that if you didn't have a sufficient reason to deny the marital debt, it was grave matter. And this is something which most people are completely unaware of because it hasn't been preached in the last 40 or 50 years. So I always tell people, everybody thinks I'm this genius, and where did he come up with this stuff? And I'm just like, all I'm doing is telling you what the saints say, right? So the point being is that this is something, so if you read, there was a manual by Prumer called Moral Theology. So he was just one that observed among many. He said, as often as the other spouse reasonably and seriously seeks the conjugal debt, sometimes called the marital debt, the other spouse is held out of justice to render it justice because it's a contract. When you get married, you cede rights over your body to your spouse. That's what you're doing at marriage. It's not just this, oh, good, we're entering into this lifelong romance. That's not what's happening here. What's happening is, yeah, I'm giving you rights over my body. And this historically means that the demons are going to attack the two things that pertain to that, what's called bed and board. Bed is the legitimacy to the conjugal act. So if one spouse asks for it, and I tell people, look, a headache isn't good enough, you know. On the other hand, if the other spouse does have a headache, as a matter of charity, you normally shouldn't ask. But here we're talking about the legitimacy of the debt that's required. So they're going to attack the normalcy of the conjugal life. And they're also going to, and a lot of that is just because they want to avert, the demons don't like people, right? So that the less number of people that we end up having from all that, the better. So the demons will suggest various things like one is not bound to the marital debt, or it's voluntary. Now, it is true that marriage is a gift of self, but you have to understand that once it's given at the day of marriage, it's no longer a gift, because the gift is gratuitous, which means you can give it or not give it. Whereas now you're underbound legally or bound morally in order to give it. And the demons are going to chisel away at that.
Well, that is probably going to ruffle some feathers with people, even a lot of Catholics. This idea that there's such thing as a marital debt. I'm glad it's a priest talking about it and not me. But this is scriptural. This is scriptural. You find this in the writings of St. Paul. And at the heart of what marriage is procreation. And he mentions here, the demons would like to get in the way of procreation and find reasons for it not to happen because they don't like people, which is ironic because I think they love to have everybody in hell, but I don't think they want people to exist. It shows sort of the strange rage of demons. But this just also shows you how absolutely grave it is to contracept and to sterilize. Usually this sort of sin of contraception is presented as something like a sin against, the natural law. It's more like I shouldn't do this because this is bad. But really, I mean, it makes the rendering of the marital debt, as he talks about, in what it's meant to be. Obviously, this is the normal way. There are exceptions. People have their different situations, and it's like anything in life. There's no fairness in biology, whatever. But obviously, following the natural law, the way things are supposed to function, the marital embrace leads to children, or at least in potential. And so, not only is contraception a sin against sort of the natural law of, going against a bodily function that's supposed to happen, but it's also a sin against the justice of marriage. I've never thought about it that way. So, interesting.
Then there's also the board part. That's something we're going to talk a little bit about later. The board part is a husband has a right for the wife to stay home and take care of the kids. The wife has a right to be supported by her husband so that she can take care of the kids. There's certain rights that it establishes in relationship to their obligations. Okay. And so this is one of the aspects of the bed and board.
I want to talk about that real quick because this idea of rights is so obfuscated by our modern culture where we think of rights as civil rights. So it's like basically we think of rights as license or privilege. But rights correspond to duties. So when he says, the husband has a right for the wife to stay home with the children, what he's also saying is the husband has a duty to provide for the children. And he does say that when the wife has a right to be provided for. And this is going to get people all annoyed and all this kind of stuff. How can you say such things? How is this something that's a right? Well, here's the reality, my friends. When you live in accordance with nature, insofar as, the functions of the human person, obviously, I'm sitting here in a home with electricity and things. There's lots of things that we do with our dominion over the world, so we're not sitting out in the woods and freezing. But our human nature doesn't change. So if you live in accordance with our human nature and what our needs are, what the needs for the human race are, what the needs for your neighbor, your spouse, and so on and so forth are, it's just simply a fact that if your wife doesn't stay home, whatever that means, it doesn't have to mean 1950s housewife sort of stereotype where, the husband goes to work in, Manhattan or whatever, and comes home on the weekend, and you have a martini for him when he gets home. But this traditional understanding of you have a home, you have children, and you have a family to raise. It's really so sad, the lies of feminism in our day. A few weeks ago, my wife was picking up something. She bought something on, Facebook Marketplace or whatever. We're picking it up from this lady's house. She was an older lady who was selling some sort of antique thing. And my wife goes up to the house and she looks into the house, and it was clear that this was an old couple. This woman clearly had stayed at home for a very long time. And she looked into her house and she said, my goodness, it's like a museum of coziness in there. Every little trinket and every little piece of decoration and artifact, and it was so perfect. And she was like, the flowers are right there, and you could tell that was why they were there, and the seasonal things. And it wasn't like some crazy mansion. It was just this woman was an artist, and she had taken care of her home for, she was probably 80 years old for a very long time. She probably got married when she was 20 or something. The way it happened for people her age, and it was something. We were talking about this and we were going, wow, that will just never happen if both spouses work. It'll just never happen. There's no way. And this is probably one of the reasons why people are so into, the cookie cutter house nowadays, and the sort of, I don't even know what the stores are called in the States, but, the stores where you sort of the things that are on fashion, and you sort of get these sets to decorate in your homes and things like that. And like, that's nice and everything, but it's soulless. It's not, it's like comparing a restaurant that you go to that's been in that same corner for 75 years and was started by, the Italian family, however many generations ago, versus the, chain restaurant. It's like, well, the chain restaurant's objectively nice and the food is good, but there's just something in the other place that is magic, And we should want that magic in our homes. We should want that. And we should want that for our children. Anyway, I just think it's beautiful. I wish more people would look at it like that. But anyway, Father Ripperger also talks about how this will end up putting children at risk.
Part is the fact that you see this being chiseled away at by the demons by driving certain things. If you want to see one of the most excoriating, brutal denigrations of women you will ever read the interview by Clara Zetkin of Vladimir Lenin. It was absolutely a complete denigration of women, even though he's talking about, women staying home is a denigration of women. No, he is destroying the value and the goods that women contribute to the home and to society. He's destroying them. And this is something, and if you get a chance, you can watch it on YouTube. I have these videos on how communist psychology and diabolic psychology are absolutely identical. There's no distinction. One just has a different veneer than the other one does. Okay. Clara Zetkin, it's right online. You can actually just find it because someone actually posted the whole thing. In fact, if you removed the references to modern day Russia in it, it would literally sound like someone just wrote it today. In fact, what it ultimately is, and this is something that we're actually going to see when I get to that point, if I get to it, because I'm talking too much, but is the fact that the attack on femininity in our culture is ultimately an attack on motherhood. And it's ultimately an attack on the good things that women actually contribute to society. There's also that some of the demons will attack the roles. We'll get to that. But also the demons will drive people to think that they need a certain standard of living that is unrealistic. People will go from what their parents' standard of living, and they expect a lateral move into marriage. When my parents grew up, it was understood. You started out probably in an apartment, and you scrimped and you scraped, and you hoped you got to the point where you could afford a home, and then you built your way up. But today, people will immediately make that lateral move, and it's only possible by debt. Right? People are going into debt. They're into debt up to their eyeballs, and then they're literally living paycheck to paycheck, which is another thing that the demons try and drive. But they expect They drive this expectation of a standard of living that is unreasonableness. And a lot of this is based on worldliness. You need the car. You need the second car. You need this stuff. You need this level of house. Because all the time I keep telling people, if women can just stay home and take care of their children, then in point in fact, people say, well, but today they need two families. Look, they need two incomes. That's just simply in most cases. Now, there might be some cases where it's actually true, but in most cases, that's not true. If you're willing to take a lower standard of living, what's contributed to the good of your children is much higher. And in the end, what the demons are getting people to do subtly is sacrifice the moral and spiritual upbringing of their children, which women contribute, for the sake of worldly goods. That's ultimately what's happening in most of these cases.
Thank you, Father Ripperger, for that advice. Let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.